Good evening and a very warm welcome to York Minster for the first of our Lent webinars on prayer. And for the next 5 weeks, either live on a Thursday evening or on catch up on our YouTube channel during the week, we will be hearing from a variety of speakers on different ways into prayer. It is one of the strategic core plans of the Minster over the next 5 years, and so we like to explore it in how it influences our own lives, but also how it might influence the church, to the churches that we represent and that we go to, but also the life of the Cathedral Church here in York. So just before we begin and before I introduce our speaker for tonight, let us just have a moment of quiet as we come into this season of Lent. Creator and creative God, journey with us through our Lenten talks. Open our hearts and minds to encounter you in new and creative ways, so that we might deepen our relationship with you, your world, and all that you have made. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So I am delighted to welcome to these webinars Deborah Lewer. Deborah is an art historian and senior lecturer in history of art at the University of Glasgow. She specialises in the history of modern German art and in the rich relationship between art, faith and theology. She is a regular speaker in churches, theological colleges, retreats and art festivals. So we're delighted, Deborah, to welcome you to set us off on our journey through Lent as we deepen our life of prayer with God in creative and different ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie, so much for that kind introduction. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you all virtually. I'm coming to you from Glasgow, so a little way from York. It would be very nice to be in the actual Minster with you, but I'm glad that we have the wonders of technology to be together. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm delighted really to have this opportunity to explore ways into prayer at this season of Lent, and to do so by thinking about visual art. So I've brought with me a whole range of images for us to look at, and some ways more suggestively than directively for us to consider possibilities for approaches to prayer that perhaps engage us in a relationship with visual images as well. And so I hope that you'll find what I've brought along this evening suggestive and enriching and generative for your imaginative life, and I hope for your prayer lives too. So Maggie mentioned already that I'm a German specialist in my art historical work. So quite a few of my examples are from German context, but not all of them by any means. We've got a wide range of examples of visual art to look at. But just to take us into our topic a little bit, I very much like something that was written by actually a theologian in a book that he wrote on works of art, John Drury, where he said, worship and looking at pictures require the same kind of attention, a mixture of curiosity with a relaxed readiness to let things suggest themselves in their own good time. I think this is a wonderful statement, both about worship and about pictures, about works of art. And I think that sense of coming to both, we can think about a life of prayer and a life of engaging with art, coming to it with curiosity, with openness, and with a readiness to allow things to suggest themselves in their own good time, I think is always an advisable way forward. I'm also struck by something that the wonderful novelist and actually occasionally art critic Jeanette Winterson said in an article in 2015. She said, visual artists do the looking on our behalf in the same way as religious orders used to pray on our behalf. That too is a very suggestive statement, I think, and raises the sense in which there might be a mode of looking, of seeing and making visual art that engages some of the mechanisms that happen in prayer, perhaps. And we're going to think today about different kinds of prayer: intercession, petition, confession, adoration, and thanksgiving. You'll notice these are not in the perhaps more familiar order that you might find these forms of prayer in liturgical worship, for example. They're in a slightly different order. But I thought in preparing this talk that these 5 quite well-known, reasonably familiar sort of forms and modes of prayer might be a helpful way, and an unusual way, into looking at works of art. So hopefully that will become clear as we go on. And I felt that I wanted to start with intercession, and I also want to start with an acknowledgement, because we are in the season of Lent, a time when we think about, among other things, we think about the need for compunction and contrition. We think about suffering and deprivation. And in intercession, of course, we pray for the needs of others. And you won't need me to remind you that at this very moment, there are wars across the world, and one particular war that's very close to us geographically. So I'm actually going to begin with some artworks that relate to experiences of war. And I'm offering these in a kind of spirit of intercession, if we can just hold that a little bit in our looking. And I begin with a woodcut by a German expressionist artist, Carl Schmidt-Rottluff, that shows the head of Christ. And this was made in 1918 in a German context. 1918 is the year of the end of the brutal devastation, 4.5 years, of the First World War. 1918 is a year in which Germany found itself humiliated, devastated, on its knees, ruptured, the empire had collapsed, and so on and so forth. And Schmidt-Rottluff presents us with this image in the manner almost of an icon of the risen Christ, with an inscription at the bottom, which is a little bit ambiguous in German, but it sort of approximately translates as 1918, the date did not Christ appear to you. And I would just draw your attention, I think this is actually a powerful Lenten image. I would draw your attention to the placing of the date 1918 on the forehead of this mourning figure of Christ, because I think it's no coincidence that it's placed where many Christians traditionally receive the mark of the ashes, the imposition of the ashes on Ash Wednesday. Some of you, I'm sure, will have attended a service I did this year, and receive that reminder of mortality, of coming from dust, going to dust, and a sealing with the sign of the cross as well. So I think this is a very evocative image to take us into thinking about war and thinking about those who have been through war, who are going through war now, and in any context that we might bring to our mind. And we're going to do that just briefly in the company of one of the most powerfully expressive artists, extraordinary artists of the 20th century, the German artist Käthe Kollwitz. In a diary from this period just after the First World War, Kollwitz noted to herself, "I want to make a drawing that shows a person who sees the suffering of the world." And she asked, can that not only be Jesus? And I find this quite a striking comment from this artist who's known for her social commitment, her commitment to social justice and so on. And not long after making that comment, she produced a series again of these stark monochromatic woodcuts in this very, very graphic, quite dramatic medium, which involves printing the cut wood block and then, inking the cut wood block and then printing it on a sheet of paper to produce these very stark impressions. She made a collection of woodcuts under the title simply War. I'm just going to show you 3 of them. I think they're profoundly moving. They're deeply humane. They're technically brilliant and innovative, very, very bold and stark and courageous in aesthetic as well as in human terms. And they focus our attention on the aftermath of war, especially on bereavement. And so we find Colwitz's image of the widow, a woman who is clutching herself at the same time that she seems to be almost clutching a void, a dark void that is both her body and suggestive of the void of the partner that she has lost in that moment of mourning and of absence. She also included an extremely poignant woodcut that gives us a very simplified, almost monumental image of a pair of grieving parents who have fallen to their knees in a posture that is suggestive of prayer, and also suggestive of the physical collapse of the grieving body. Notice how they fall into one another. Unlike the widow who is alone, clasping and embracing the void, these parents clasp and embrace one another as they suffer together. And just one last example from this series is Colwitz's woodcut of the mothers. These are mothers who have come out of a traumatic war. Implicitly, we might be invited to imagine they have lost their elder sons, perhaps. They have lost their husbands, their fathers, their boyfriends, their brothers in the war. And now they cling together in a shared experience of grief and bereavement. And you can see that this massed body of women, very determined, very strong, very stocky bodies, large hands, what they're sheltering within their community almost are the children, the young children. You can just see faces poking out. This is a profoundly pacifist work on the part of Kita Colwitz that invites us to consider the future of these children who need to be protected from war. And indeed, I think suggestively protected from the threat of conscription in a future war when they are older. And I say that because Colwitz was involved in anti-war, making more explicitly anti-war images like posters and so on than this. Just one final detail I'll point out to you here is these women here who seem perhaps to be pregnant with children to come, these swelling bellies here, and particularly this figure on the left who seems to repel with her hands the prospect of war. So those perhaps are images that we could think of in an intercessory mode if we look prayerfully, if you like. Or we can simply read them in a sort of metaphorical sense as intercessory images. I would like to reassure you that some aspects of this talk will become a little bit more cheerful than that rather melancholic beginning. But of course, Lent is a season for thinking about suffering and about need, and in particular thinking about Jesus's journey to the Passion, to Holy Week, what we now celebrate as Holy Week, ultimately to his death and crucifixion. And the great image, or many of the great images of Jesus in prayer, are images of petitionary prayer. Quintessentially, the Garden of Gethsemane, the night into the dawn of the day of Christ's arrest, his interrogation and mocking and humiliation, and eventually, of course, the passage to crucifixion. But through this night, we have this very evocative image of Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane while the disciples, Peter, James, and John, sleep beside him, very human in their failure to stay awake through the night. And I think it's the Gospel of Mark that tells us 3 times they fell asleep as Jesus prayed, echoed in the 3 slumped bodies here. Look at Jesus at his kind of prayer stool that the Venetian artist Giovanni Bellini has made out of a piece of rock. There's so much going on in this landscape that is expressive of what's happening, the kind of swirling currents of the it's rather Italianate landscape, bringing the soldiers who are on their way, led by Judas, coming to identify and arrest Christ. But Christ is still in this posture of prayer. The sun is rising, it's dawn, there's a pink glow on the horizon. And just up here, you can see in the sky a small cherub-like angel who holds a cup. And we know, of course, that Jesus's petitionary prayer to God that night was, "May this cup pass from me, but not my will, but yours be done." It's an extremely poignant and powerful subject in art that has been rendered, I think, very movingly by Rembrandt a couple of centuries later, in a different context, a different medium, using the medium of etching, at which Rembrandt excelled so extraordinarily. And here, just a couple of things to notice. We've got the sleeping disciples down there, slumped in the bottom left-hand corner. You can just see the soldiers entering the gate into the garden. But look at Christ in this representation. We feel his anguish, but instead of a distant angelic figure holding the cup, Rembrandt has Christ comforted by God in the form of an angel, or at least supported in some way, engaged with in some ways, a deeply relational image. And I was very struck in thinking about these Rembrandt images of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane by this little pen and ink drawing, which actually shows again this compassionate embrace of an angel around, sort of embracing the body of Christ at his moment of need and of suffering and of prayer, as well as of readiness and of obedience and so on. And here, rather sweetly, I think, you actually have the more traditional sort of cherubic figure, a little angel with the cup. And Rembrandt positions this kind of unusual trio of figures in the garden in a kind of, I think, a posture of shared concern that's very human, it's very empathetic, it's very compassionate. And I think it's a wonderful example of how an artist can lead us in our own contemplation of this quite familiar narrative in many ways, to lead us to think about dimensions of compassion and relationality at an instant that is more commonly represented, or maybe exists in our imagination, as a time of abandonment and aloneness for Jesus there. So I think a good example of art opening up for the imagination, or generating new possibilities. I want to take us to look at some contemporary art, a work that I find very fascinating and I've written about and thought about at great length, but I'll just talk briefly about here, is an installation by the Cologne-based artist, Rosemarie Trockel, made in 1993 in a very liberal and very innovative Jesuit church in Cologne, St. Peter's, which embraces contemporary art and contemporary music in a very radical way. I can talk a bit more about that if you want to in the questions, but just look at what we have here. The artist was invited to make an installation in the church, and in the place where we might ordinarily find a triptych-like altarpiece, just behind the altar, the Eucharistic space here, we simply have 3 words in German: Ich habe Angst. Those 3 words translate as I am afraid. That's how you say I am afraid in German. More literally, they translate as I have fear, but Ich habe Angst is how you say I am afraid in German. And we can just think a little bit about what it means to express and to encounter those words in the chancel at the altar or the communion table, at the site of breaking, sharing bread and wine, of remembering Jesus's body, of remembering the Passion, remembering the Last Supper, and thinking about fear, thinking about the fear of people who enter church and for all sorts of reasons come with fear, even fear of church itself. For some people, church isn't a safe space or hasn't been. There are all kinds of ways in which this very simple installation involves potential for great relationality, but I think also carries with it a connection with the fear that we know that Jesus must have felt in that night of prayer whilst his disciples slept in the garden. It's maybe worth just considering, certainly where I come from or where I'm based in Scotland. I attend a Scottish Episcopal church, and part of our Eucharistic liturgy involves these words: God is love and we are God's children. There is no room for fear in love. We love because God loved us first. Let us confess our sins in penitence and faith. And I often think about this in relation to this work. If once we've said there is no room for fear in love, what do we do with fear? That's just a thought to leave for you to think about. Another couple of photographs of that work. Thinking about confession, this is a section I could have just extended and extended, because so many thoughts came to my mind around confession of our own failings in prayer, acknowledgement and confession of sin. And I'll just quickly show you some images that I just want to show you suggestively in relation to confession. As a major American photographer, Mitch Epstein, produced a series, American Power. It's an important photographic series that very critically looks at the impact of our appetite, or America's, but we can think the developed or the industrialized world's appetite for power, and the impact that this has on life, on nature, on people, ordinary people living in small dwellings like this in the shadow of power stations, for example. He said, with American Power, I'm trying to find and convey truth about how we Americans live, what we want, and what it costs to get it. So he makes works like this, showing the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina with a tree strewn with debris. It reminds me a little bit of images of devastation, of almost sort of post-military wilderness, such as the devastation of after the absolutely thorough bombing of the carpet bombing of Dresden by the Allies during the Second World War, and this famous photograph that appears to show one of the sandstone figures on the town hall grieving over that wasted city and those lost lives. Thinking of confession and wilderness, I am very struck by the work of another photographer, a German, Andreas Gursky, who specializes in these vast almost universalizing images of vast structures that tell us something about our contemporary society. This one is called Amazon. And think about it, perhaps in relation to another photograph by Gursky, which is of the Rhine. There's a reference here to the river Amazon, and of course, a reference to our rampant consumerism that is so neatly summarized in the name of that company, of Amazon. And he gives us a photograph of this endless expanse of commodities, parcels, books, products, stacked shelves that feed our appetites, our unquenchable appetite for consumption. These are other works made by Gursky. He says if you get close to them, they can be read down to the smallest detail. Seen from a distance, they become mega signs. So he gives us an image of the abstraction of these relationships, these economics, and the relationships of labor. But if you look as a viewer in an art gallery, closer and closer at the images, you begin to see individuals. This is one that struck me very much when I saw it at an exhibition, and I took some photographs of the work and found my gaze held in particular by one woman in this factory in Vietnam, and on an industrial scale, making items for sale out of various forms of wicker. And it prompted me to think about, from a confessional point of view, about how perhaps we so easily forget who makes our products, the conditions in which they're made, the conditions in which they are delivered to us, for example. Something to think about. It makes me think of the wonderful writer Thomas Merton, one of my favorite writers in any theological context, and this extraordinary passage from one of his deeply powerful and polemic essays from 1966, where he wrote, "We live in the time of no room, which is the time of the end, the time when everyone is obsessed with lack of time, lack of space, with saving time, conquering space, projecting into time and space the anguish produced within them by the technological furies of size, volume, quantity, speed, number, price, power, and acceleration." A little bit later on in that essay, he says, "Into this world, this demented inn, in which there is absolutely no room for him at all, Christ has come uninvited." And that makes me think of the technological furies of size, volume, quantity, speed, and so on in the photographs that we've been looking at. And then the uninvited Christ in the demented inn, which makes me think about this painting, which I love very much, and which takes us in to the attitude in prayer of adoration, because this painting is Peter Bruegel the Elder's Adoration of the Kings in the Snow, in brackets, known also as Epiphany. It's a little bit unseasonal to think about Epiphany, perhaps in Lent, but I think I like the way that I think it can be connected with this thinking about prayer, about confession, and about adoration, and a sense in which prayer is fluid and organic, and it's a cycle, and it involves all of these dimensions which are interrelated, I think, in a rich life of prayer. And here we have people coming to kneel in prayer, extraordinarily right at the far margins of the composition here. It's one of the reasons why I find this painting so deeply resonant, is because it resonates with that Merton point about Christ coming where there is absolutely no room for him at all. The Holy Family are squeezed right down there into the bottom left-hand corner. Jesus is a tiny, indistinguishable bundle. There are actually only a couple of figures, or a few figures, kneeling in prayer. And look at what all the others are doing. Some are heading towards this rickety shelter, but so many people in this Flemish village in the snow are just busy getting on with their lives, dealing with the harsh weather, pulling water out, playing on the ice, collecting wood for fires, trudging through the snow, going about that sort of hectic daily life, or hectic as far as it is hectic in a 17th century Flemish village in the snow. And it's into that world, that real world, that Christ comes. It makes me think of something, sorry, there should be an E on, it's not Simone Weil, it's of course Simone Weil, in her some of her writing that's been collected in a volume called Waiting for God, where she says, on God's part, creation is not an act of self-expansion, but of restraint and of renunciation. She goes on to talk about the self-emptying of God in terms that can relate as well to the incarnation, and that sense of diminution that has such humility about it in something like this. So I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I've brought us to our final category of prayer, which is thanksgiving. And here again, there are so many ways in which we might think visually about our own gratitude, or perhaps a shared corporate, even global sense of that for which we should be thankful, that for which perhaps we're not always thankful. Thinking about thankfulness, I ended up deciding just to talk a little bit about this work by Tracy Emin that I'm sure many of you listening and looking will know. You may well have seen it. It's in Liverpool Anglican Cathedral. It's an installation made in pink neon by Tracy Emin. It consists of this single pink neon sentence in the exact form of her own personal handwriting. And the sentence reads, "I felt you and I knew you loved me." And the title of the work is For You. It's a wonderful title, I think, for this work, for all kinds of reasons. And it's installed there now, I think more or less permanently, having been originally installed for an art festival in Liverpool. And if you go, you see it as part of the body, the fabric of the church, and as this line of illumination that becomes clear only when you have a little bit of proximity to it. Look at the verbs here: feeling, knowing, loving. It's deeply relational, and the pronouns as well. I, you. There's that sort of profoundly communicative and kind of relational statement of a kind of confession in a way. But I think it has a sense of gratitude and thanksgiving about it that comes out of what we sense is a life richly lived, perhaps dramatically lived, perhaps lived with pain as well, maybe lived with failings and so on, an ordinary life. The title reminds us, of course, of the words, take, eat, this is my body which is given for you. I think it's a profoundly Eucharistic work that involves an intimacy with the body and the bodily experiences of this woman, who's very well known for a life that many would describe as having been quite chaotic, certainly in her youth. She's been very open and confessional about issues with addiction, issues with experiences of sexual violence and exploitation, with the termination of pregnancies and all kinds of other issues that Tracy Emin has been very, very open about. And it's, I think, extremely poignant to find this woman known for an earlier work, the detritus of her unmade bed, in the space of the sanctuary with this statement of intimacy, with all the ambiguity of whether this is a statement that comes from a love letter, private diary, from the bedroom, or whether it is a statement addressed to God and in witness to a love that has been felt and known by a woman. I like very much that the work if you stand with your back to the high altar in Liverpool Anglican Cathedral and look all the way down, you can actually see it shining at you there. And I was doing a workshop with some ordinands at one point where somebody made the very, I think, excellent observation. Suddenly somebody piped up and said, "Oh, it's what the priest sees when they break the bread or fracture the host," which I think gives it all a further resonance for us to think about. I'm going to end now. I've gone at a rather speedy speed, but I'm happy to, take questions and hear any comments and responses that you have. But just in closing, I'd like to just finish with a simple prayer. It's prayer for Lent that I like very much, which is written by the great prayer writer, a writer of prayer and poetry and more scholarly works as well, Monica Furlong. That's the text of the prayer on the screen, so you can see roughly what's coming. But I'm going to read it and pray it with a couple of images, and you can just follow if you want to say them out loud, you can, or just read on the screen. So, a prayer for Lent. Let us pray. We need time, space, simplicity in our lives, enough bareness to discern the outline of who we are and how we should live. Let us use Lent as a time of peace and reflection, in which we withdraw from getting and spending and desiring. And remember the love which upholds us. Lent is a time for clarity, as when the bare boughs of winter show us the shape of the tree in austere beauty. Let us clear away the clutter of our lives in order to see the underlying pattern. Amen. So thank you for listening. That's the end of a little bit of a whistle-stop tour through some works of art, but I just really hope that it's been helpful for you and maybe suggestive of new ways of thinking about art and prayer.
Gosh, I don't even know where to begin thanking you for your presentation this evening, the depth in which you were able to bring us into in such a short period of time, and the way that you split it up into those 5 areas of intercession, petition, confession, adoration and thanksgiving, and then the way that you brought all of that together in a beautiful moment of prayer at the end of it. So thank you so much for that, and I kind of also appreciate the fact that we do record these so that I can go back and listen to it all again, and also to look up some of these great pieces of work that you added into here. The bit that challenged me most, if I can just start very personally, I think, was the juxtaposition of the Amazon and Amazon. And I think if artists, it also challenges us to review how we think about the world in which we live, then for me at this particular moment, on this particular evening during your presentation, that for me is the challenge of art, that we come across things sometimes not looking for it, that suddenly make us sit up and look and think, oh my goodness, And that is, for me, the bit that the intersection of prayer and art come together, because at that moment, all we can do really is fall on our knees and pray, and then change the way that we act and interact with our world. So thank you personally for what you have given us this evening. And I know that there have been a few questions, but I think the people were so involved in what you were saying, I think they've kind of just been taken up into all of that. But I'll start with a couple of questions. So from other people. So you talked about visual art as a way into prayer, and the act of viewing art as a form of worship. Can you reflect on the use and making of icons from the Orthodox tradition, and whether we can learn anything from this tradition as we try to use art to pray?
And that's of course, a fascinating question. I considered talking about icons in this talk, but I actually chose not to, partly because it's partly, in a sense, wanting to maintain something of the distinctiveness of icons. I think that icons they almost exist in another category, but they are so fascinating as material objects that go beyond their material status, and that is both in the sense of their making and in the sense of their apprehension by those who pray with them, who live with them. There are many traditions in the Orthodox tradition, for example, of living with icons, having them in your home. Many people do in other traditions as well. I have some icons in my home as well. And but I think where they intersect with some of what we were looking at this evening has to do with something around intimacy and distance, because icons, in a sense, are able to open up onto, if you like, a kind of scale of the divine that is beyond materiality, and particularly in the, if you like, in the Orthodox understanding of them, not only as material objects, but as a kind of window, if you like, as a way through or into something. But they also have this intimate quality and this quite domestic quality often. They're also the result of very, very intense physical engagement on the part of the person making them or writing them, as that verb is sometimes used. So there's an awful lot more that could be said about icons and their richness in this kind of relationship. But yes, I also like to think about, you know, the echoes of icons in other art as well.
There was a kind of a supplementary to that question which came in as you were talking, which was, can you explain about the other category of icons? And she found that the person who asked the question, the other category of icons, which she said right at the beginning, and whether you can say that a little bit more about what you meant by that.
Okay. Well, I think it's partly to do with the idea of icons being part of a different species of painting. An icon is not the same as an altarpiece, for example, or it has a different function because of the centrality of the icon in prayer, and the centrality of prayer in the icon, and the sense of the icon as mediating in some way, as being in a particularly theological sense, having a mediumistic or a medial quality about it, which is an interesting word, because of course we also talk in terms of other artworks about the medium of the artwork, that which conveys the meaning. And an icon is in many senses, in a sort of quite essential sense, a medium, if that helps at all with that.
And of course, when people are making icons, the whole thing of it is that in the kind of even preparing the material in which the icon then painted onto, that's part of the whole preparation of prayer, of the icon as well. So it's actually the whole making of the material before one even starts to begin to actually create the image on it as well, I think.
Yes,
So,
and the training that goes into it, and it's not just training in a technical sense, it's actually spiritual preparation as well.
Yeah. Okay, I'll follow that up with something to do with Lectio Divina, which is somebody has written, I have recently come across doing Lectio with art, with art, nature and music as well as words, and use ordinary pictures to meditate on. We have to pause, sorry if I find it difficult to read this, we have to pause our busy lives to see where God is in our lives. I think, how do we tell others about this form of worship when worship to many people is praise, song, and something you do on Sunday morning?
Oh, well, it's a lovely question. And I think really just, mindful of our short time that we have, I will simply answer it by telling you about a wonderful friend of mine who, it just so happens that she's ordained, she's a priest. But the brilliant thing about her is she's told me that her personal own prayer practice involves every morning she takes out from a massive stack of art postcards that she has them at home. She takes, without looking, she takes just the one off the top, without knowing what it is, and she sits with it, and no matter what it is, she prays with it. And she tells me that every single time she is completely astonished by what comes, because often she doesn't particularly like the postcard, or she thinks, oh, this isn't relevant, or I wish I didn't have this on. But if she finds that if she sits and perseveres with it, that the image becomes involved in her prayer, and that this has completely transformed and enlivened her prayer life since she started doing it. So I just pass that on, and I think it's a wonderful example of one way to engage with art in prayer.
And I don't know if the follow-up is from the same person, but a follow-up question to that is, do you find, I think it's a personal question to you, Deborah, that you have images for prayer that you return to again and again, or do you move through images on your journey with God? Have you got any long-term favourites that you can share with us?
Oh gosh. Well, there are many actually, but I have a particular, I get very struck by details. That's often what it is. It'll be a detail that I notice in a work of art. Oh gosh, there are many examples I can think of, but there's just, I remember being very, very deeply moved by a tiny panel in the Louvre, that's a little Italian panel. It's very small, and it actually shows Saint Jerome, the legend of Saint Jerome with the lion, where he removes the thorn from the lion's paw, and the poor lion looks absolutely horrified at the humiliation of having to have this thorn removed from his paw. And it's an image that just spoke to me very profoundly of my own path to faith. And I quite like the absurdity around that personal connection between, in case it's not clear, I'm the lion and having the thorn removed from my paw by Saint Jerome / God. So that's an image that I keep a reproduction of, because it reminds me of that, and it hasn't lost its power to move me over the years. So
I picked, whilst you were talking with the images that you chose to share with us a little bit this evening, that actually your attention to detail is there on the two that in particular was the sketch by Rembrandt and the holding up of the angel, and how that kind of echoed the Bellini the picture, but in a very small way. But you were really focused in on being upheld by God in the form of an angel, but also in the Bruegel one, in which actually I didn't see that. Now that might be because of the image on a computer, but actually you're quite, that everybody bypasses the stable, and actually that, it's right down in the very bottom corner of the picture, but actually the whole canvas is people walking by. And I think that, again, actually having somebody with your eye to pick out that kind of detail that many of us would have walked past like everybody else. So, for me, that again, I'd like to go and look at that image and spend some time with that image. It's just in the same way as the person about the Lectio Divina. I thought that was a very creative response that your friend does with art. And as a great collector of art postcards from around the place, I think actually that's probably what I should do with mine as well. So thank you both for that, and for that. So moving on. So going on to bringing it up to the Tracy Emin thing, many people love the Tracy Emin in the Liverpool Cathedral. I remember taking a group of parishioners there about a decade ago now, and it really had a mixed response. Some people just, what on earth is that doing there? And what is this kind of brash kind of pink neon light, what, that's not art, so then actually, but I love the way about what the priest said, and the fracturing looking down there and will encounter, which is again another way of looking, to be honest. So sticking with that, this person says, so we love the Tracy Emin in Liverpool Cathedral in terms of integrating modern art into historic and very old cathedrals like York Minster. How would you begin the process of commissioning religious or liturgical art for holy spaces?
Gosh, that's a big question. Personally, I would refer anyone wanting to do that, I would refer them to the example of St. Peter's in Cologne, the Jesuit church in Cologne, because they have decades long experience of radically making space for art. And actually what they don't do is commission, they invite artists to come to use the space to make an installation, but they don't tell the artist what to install. So in other words, the space is made available to the artist. And in my own view, so a phrase that they use is something around art allowing epiphanies of the godly to occur. And there's something I think really fundamentally important about freedom, the freedom of creativity and so on, that I think can be stifled certainly if a committee is involved in deciding what a piece of art should involve or look like. I'm trying to be diplomatic here, but hopefully the point that I'm making is reasonably clear. So, I mean, if anyone's seriously thinking about it, please, just look. It really is a shining example, in my opinion. St. Peter's Art Station in Cologne. But there are other great examples as well, including Liverpool. I think, the Emin work, to me, is exemplary in that sense.
Thank you. That's a great response to that. So this is kind of winding out from the personal, really, to the more corporate. So thinking about art with liturgical prayer thinking about art with liturgical prayer prompts, can you say something about the possibilities of corporate prayer using art in addition for our private devotion?
Yes, I've had some experience with that. So I sometimes speak at clergy conferences on art and so on. And a couple of times I've worked with people organising worship there, and we've integrated works of art into the fairly formal diocesan, gathered worship in a clergy conference context. And what's been really wonderful was a couple of times we built a liturgy around the artwork. So we started with the artwork rather than the other way around, if that makes sense. So, I mean, it was using the Scottish Episcopal set liturgies. It wasn't anything wild. It was quite, drawing on the set materials. But using works of art to sort of set the key theme, so one theme was that we are created, one theme was that we are loved, one theme was that we are forgiven. It's that kind of thing, but starting with the artwork. One of them, incidentally, was the Tracy Emin, I think, and so that's one way to approach it. And then obviously you have an image of the artwork that people can see, either that they can hold in their hands or you can project it.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. Okay, and this is going to be our last question, I think, so, and brings us right up to today. So in Ukraine, people are desperately trying to save significant pieces of religious art, including paintings and crucifixes. How does it make you feel when you see the desecration and destruction of religious art? Is it like trampling on prayer?
Well, it's of course heartbreaking and devastating for many reasons, primarily for the people who are losing their heritage. I would say the people are always more important than the material art objects. Personally, my personal view is that art that is made for a religious space is not inherently more valuable than art generally per se. So personally, I wouldn't draw much of a distinction between quote unquote religious art and secular art. I think all great art is a product of human creativity and should be cherished, and that we must mourn and confess and feel compunction when the fruits of human creativity are destroyed.
Yeah. I think just again, if I just immediately brought to mind the Picasso Guernica when you said all of that, and it reminded me of the story of the SAS storming into his room in Paris and picking up a postcard of Guernica, and they went, "Did you?" and threw it down in front of him. "Did you do that?" To which he responded, "No, you did." You know, and it was this kind of, you know, actually the destruction is not about the art, it's about what actually is behind it as well. So so thank you for that. Wow, guys, again, you know, it's one of my favourite topics, so I'm so delighted to be able to begin this Lent series with you on prayer and art. But as we go through Lent, we will add to this in different ways as well. So so thank you, Deborah, for your time this evening.
Thank you for having me.
You know, and a beautiful presentation. I personally, and I'm sure everybody else, really appreciated it as well. And so I will end with a short prayer this evening and thank everybody for joining us tonight. Again, I know that a lot of people do follow, we'll pick this up during the week on the YouTube channel, on our Minster YouTube channel. So please do let people know about that. Just to end with this evening with a short prayer. Spirit of God, creative inspiration of all that we do and all that is beautiful, we thank you for all the creative ways in which we are able to encounter you through painting and sculpture, music, drama and literature, and all the endeavours which point us beyond ourselves. We thank you for every enrichment of our humanity and for the rededication which so naturally follows. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you and good night.